the first question, just to make sure. Second, if I could get a thumbs up if you see your favorite or one of your favorite dishes on the screen. Oh, not so much from David. Let me start by saying how delightful it is to see such an amazing audience with some of my favorite people on the planet, and a bunch of people who, if I knew them, I'm sure would be in that category as well. And to thank Brian and to thank Helen and all of the others from the Slovak American Association who have helped to make this happen. We really appreciate it, and we are thankful for all of the things that you do in a whole variety of ways. And I am particularly thankful for yesterday's Halushkathon, which was a really remarkable experience for me. And I actually managed to make halushki for the first time. And despite the lack of brinza, I actually managed a passable effort. My son, who is a big halushki fan, was moderately impressed, which is saying a lot for him. And he said he's had worse halushki in Slovak restaurants. So that may say more about the restaurants than it does about my halushki. But I want to thank you all, and your association really has filled an important gap for a lot of us, whether that is language practice lessons, which I haven't yet been able to participate in fully, or these cooking lessons, or these kinds of enrichment events. And I'm just really thankful for all the work that you do. And if you're not out there, if you're out there and haven't become a member, I would encourage you to follow my lead on this. After having been involved in other associations, I'm a member of this one as well. So thanks, and let me get started by just giving you a little bit of a context. I'm going to hand it over in a minute to my colleague, Tim Haughton, but we wanted to sort of let you know that the two of us have been engaged in studies of Slovakia for what seems now to be a very long time. And in fact, neither of us are of Slovak heritage. We are both from different places, but this is a country that we have come to love. And to spend a lot of time in, and to try and think about deeply and richly. And Slovakia has given back everything in double, triple fold, because it has provided us with amazing colleagues, some of whom are on the call today, and a really remarkable field of study, and a place where we can look at the world in a kind of microcosm and learn new things. And one of the things that we'll be talking about is the way that it's not just the case anymore that Eastern European countries get used as testing laboratories for Western and American experiments, but that they actually help to generate theories and help us understand more about the world than we did before we studied them. So the outcome of a lot of our work, which really began back in 2005, when Tim and I started working together, and we started looking very closely at that time, a sort of medium-sized political party called Smer, was over the last 15 years to develop a rather elaborate set of theories and understandings about political parties and political party systems, using Slovakia as our starting point. It's not where we stopped, but it's where we started. And it's always nice to come back around to be able to thank the country where we got our start, and actually to be able to see whether what we studied still applies in that particular country. And so really what we're going to talk about today is a kind of reapplication of what we did in our book, based on what we learned in Slovakia and other places, coming back around and saying, how well does this fit Slovakia? Those of you who've seen us present before will know that we've often started with the theme of crazy. And frankly, if you saw my kitchen after I finished the halushki, it would look pretty crazy. But that Slovakia's political party system, to the uninitiated, can look pretty weird, especially for those from the US or the UK. And so what we'd like to do is to try and make a little bit of sense of this using what we've been discovering in Slovakia and elsewhere. And so I realize that in the process, there are some people on the call who know these systems very well, really intimately, as well or better than Tim or I. And there are others for whom this is not necessarily something that you really have spent a lot of time thinking about. You'd rather be making halushki or working on folk dancing or other things. So this isn't, we realize, a part of everybody's Slovak heritage. So we want to kind of cut a middle ground and talk about it not from a purely advanced standpoint. We might go a little bit beyond absolute beginner standpoint. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to let us know. Drop it in the chat, and we'll try and take those questions first when we finish. But the big things that we really want to say is to acknowledge and to sort of draw attention to the fact that Slovak politics is really, really complicated for a country of 5.5 million people, a country not that much bigger than the metro area where I live or where Tim lives. This is a remarkably complicated set of political systems. And as part of that, new political parties, the coming and going of new entities is really important, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down at all. So if you think, when you look at Slovak politics, I don't recognize any of those people, that's not unusual, because we have often the same impression. Things are moving so fast and there's no deceleration at the moment. But then what we want to do, actually, and this is where Tim's gonna dive in, is to show that this actually this newness, this constant emergence, this is actually something of a Slovak tradition over the past 30 years. And it's not just a Slovak tradition. It's actually something that we see across the Central and Eastern European region, and in fact, in the world as a whole. In a lot of countries, this is becoming the big thing. In some ways, Slovaks are simply ahead of the curve on this. And then we want to finish up by talking, really just thinking a little bit about whether what we're seeing is a good thing or a bad thing. And if it's something that isn't ideal, what we can do about it. So that's our big picture. I want to take each of those in turn, and I want to start by just simply acknowledging that Slovakia's political parties system, Slovakia's politics itself are complicated. If you are, like me, growing up used to an American political system where you have two big parties, a couple of really tiny ones, where those parties share the vote roughly equally, where those parties have shared the vote roughly equally as long as I've been alive, or my father, or my grandfather, or my great-grandfather, then Slovakia's system is going to look a little bit strange to you. A system where in the most recent election, and these are the results of the 2020 election, the largest party, and the largest party by a good margin, got a quarter of the vote. And then the number of parties that got significant numbers of votes extended into double digits. This is really complicated. And it's even more complicated because of the things that Slovakia's political parties fight about. You know, in America, we tend to think of things as liberal or conservative, as left or right. I think the United States is actually more complicated than that. That's a discussion for another day. But Slovak political parties and Slovak politics, they fight about more things than this. So they don't just fight about the economic left, where you tax more and spend more, or the economic right, where you tax less and spend less. They fight about that. They certainly do. And parties have positions on those. But they also fight, I would say, as we do in the United States, about cultural questions, questions about abortion, and questions about gay and lesbian rights, questions about book censorship, and questions about guns, questions about religion. The Slovak discussions are slightly different than in the United States, but that dimension exists as well. And every party has a unique position on those that don't necessarily correspond to their position on the economic question. So they're suddenly scattered across the board. And then in addition to that, it's related, but it's not exactly the same, a series of positions about how you feel about your nation and which nation really owns the country in Slovakia. So we can actually think about, a Slovak national poll and a Hungarian national poll, and a more to put it in maybe the best words we can find, a kind of cosmopolitan or tolerant poll. You have parties with multiple positions on those kinds of questions, and parties occupy positions on those. And then, to make things even more complicated, over the last 15 years, we've seen yet another. So you take this two-dimensional frame, you can actually add a third dimension, and that's about corruption and anti-corruption. Now, no parties claim to be the party of corruption, but a lot of parties claim to be the party of anti-corruption. And so if you want to look at it, you get a lot of different parties claiming to be the party that's going to come in and clean things up finally. And no party was more emphatic about that, believed stronger about that than that Obyčajní ľudí party, the party that won that 25% and currently holds the prime ministership. So Slovakia has lots of political parties. They occupy lots of different positions on a lot of different issues. They also, unlike the United States, they move around a lot, so that parties change in their relative popularity much faster than they do in the United States. One of the things that Tim and I are fortunate enough to be able to do every few years is to write little pieces for the Washington Post about Slovakia's politics. And kudos to the Post for actually bringing in experts on a whole variety of issues. There's something called the Monkey Cage blog on the Washington Post website, where they bring in academics and experts who work on particular issues. And so one of the things we've done every 4 years or so is to create a new graph about what's gone on in Slovakia's election. So this is the graph that we did for the 2020 Slovak elections, and you can see the arrows there show the increases. So, or people, the party that got 25%, had only got 11% in the previous election. So it more than doubled its score. Whereas the party Smer that I mentioned had gone from 28% to 18%. So it lost a third of its total vote. And you can see that all the way along. Multiple parties sort of moved. A couple didn't change, but a lot did. And then some popped up out of nowhere. So at least 4 new parties emerged from not existing before to suddenly show up on Slovakia's political party stage. And other parties, like the Slovak National Party or the party Mosted of the Hungarian population, those parties actually lost more than half of their total votes from one election to the next. So we see an enormous amount of change in addition to that huge amount of fragmentation. And I mentioned this, you can see the kinds of parties that were losers in the last election. 3 of those parties had actually been part of the government. And there was a 4th party actually that didn't even make it to the next, that lost all of its votes from the previous election. But most of those parties had actually done really well in the previous election, did really quite poorly in this election. On the other hand, you had winners, as I mentioned, 4 of them completely new entities who together totaled a 1/6 of the total electorate of Slovakia voted for a party that didn't exist before. And then another 1/6 of Slovakia's electorate shifted from some other party to a party that had existed but hadn't been nearly as popular. So you get the growth of a bunch of these new parties. These parties ended up forming the government, at least 3 of these 4 parties did, whereas the losers ended up leaving government. And then you've got some parties that did roughly the way they'd run before. One of them is Kotleba's really radical right, almost neo-Nazi party, and then some really old standards in Slovakia's politics. The Christian Democratic Movement, which has been around for a long time, but for the last couple of elections hasn't been in parliament because they haven't made it over that 5% threshold that you need to get into parliament. And the same is true of the Hungarian party, the Hungarian Coalition Party of Slovakia. So we see a variety of different trends, both levels of popularity and changes, modifications in political party status. Now, most of you know that Slovakia has a 5% threshold. They use a proportional representation system. So you get roughly the same number of seats, the same share of seats as you get the share of votes, but you got to get over 5%. In order to get in. So the smaller parties get excluded. This time, actually about 20+% of Slovakia's voters voted for parties that didn't make it into that parliament, didn't make it over that 5% threshold, in part because there is an additional clause to that 5% threshold, which says that if you form a formal coalition, 2 parties formally agree to work together, it's not just 4% or 5%, it's 7%. And one party in Slovakia's system, the coalition of Progressive Slovakia and Spolu together, that party came achingly close, got 6.97%, needing 7%. And so they didn't actually make it into parliament. So this is Slovakia parliament, and from your parliament, because Slovakia has a parliamentary form of government in which the parliament is the one that elects the executive, somehow you've got to get these parties together, a majority of the seats represented by those parties together in order to form a government. That means you need to scrape together 76 seats out of some combination of these. And what we ended up with was this particular combination. So the run by the the businessman Igor Matovic, who until recently was the prime minister, the single largest party, but the party Sme Rodina, or We Are Family, run by the entrepreneur, radio station owner Boris Kolar, the party Freedom and Solidarity, run by the economist Richard Sulik, and the party Zaludi, formerly run and only recently changed by President Andrej Kiska. So these were the parties that actually managed to form that coalition government. And we've seen over the past year a real roller coaster in, at first, relative success in fighting COVID, and then relative failure in actually managing to keep the death rates down, and problems with which vaccine would be used and how many of those vaccines would be used, and a whole variety of other internal squabbles, ultimately producing a change in the formal leadership of the government, if not of the political parties themselves. So that Eduard Heger becomes the prime minister, someone within the Ordinary People Party, but not the leader of that party, while the party leader transfers to the finance ministry and still kind of acts as if he runs the government. This is the current government of Slovakia, and the current opposition of Slovakia, the party Smer, which for a long time dominated Slovakia's politics under Robert Fico, and Kotleba's really extreme right neo-Nazi political party, the People's Party, Our Slovakia. But these parties too have seen their share of upheaval. So shortly after the election, though I just wanted to say, actually, we'll see this, that, hold on a second here, wait, that Fico's party split in half, with a little bit fewer than half of the deputies, and far more than half of the total popular support going to a new party called Hlas, run by the former Prime Minister Pellegrini. And so that party now is actually the leader by a significant margin in the public opinion polling. We also get a shift in Kotleba's party, which has suffered a variety of both legal and internal challenges, and the creation of a new party called the Movement of the Republic. And that party actually has a number of deputies in parliament as well, splitting the Kotleba's party and really causing both of them to fall below that 5% threshold in public opinion polls. And some change among the Hungarian parties. Now, Carol Lefo, I see, is on this call, has actually spoken to a number of different groups with lots of information, lots of eloquence. What I've learned about this, I've learned from Carol. But what we've seen in the last last decade or so is that a variety of different Hungarian parties competing against one another for a decreasing share of the Hungarian vote has caused all of those parties to fall below the 5% threshold, because they split it roughly evenly. After several election cycles of Hungarians getting together more than 5%, but not having it in the same party, it would appear that the two larger Hungarian parties and one smaller Hungarian party have actually agreed to form a new party called Alliance. It's funny, as someone who pays a lot of attention to political party logos, it looks a lot like an IKEA logo. So we'll see if it's a kind of flat pack, do-it-yourself thing, or whether it stays together. I see a lot of IKEA furniture out by the roadside these days. So we will see if that actually holds together. But at least for the moment, we have the emergence of yet another new party. So, I mean, just think of all of that I've told you. There have been more changes in Slovakia's political party scene in the last year than in American politics in my lifetime, in terms of the number of parties, how those parties do, the variation in those party scores, and so on. It's a really big it's a really big deal. And the number of parties in that frame that are new, and I bumped past a couple of slides, but the current government, there's no party in that government that's more than 11 years old. And the current opposition, there's no party in there that's more than 18 years old. So we're talking not only lots of change, but we're talking not a lot of institutional continuity. And that's really the kind of issue that I want to raise with you, and that Tim's going to talk about in greater detail. But there is a ton of novelty. Slovakia's political parties come and go, and they change hands really, really rapidly. So I'm going to actually hand this over to Tim, and he's going to talk a little bit about the role of novelty in Slovakia's political party scene. And then we're going to tie it more broadly to the region and do a little thinking about whether it's a good idea or not. Tim.
Okay, so firstly, I would just like to say ďakujem veľmi pekne to Helen and Brian for the opportunity to talk to you all today. Thank you all for coming, and a big ďakujem to my awesome co-author. Thanks, Kevin, for this and for collaboration over many years. So indeed, I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual Slovak party scene. But before getting going on that, it's about 7:30 in Slovakia. It's time for pohádky. So I'm going to start by telling you actually how we, oh, I'm sorry. I'm out of kilter. Sorry, Kevin. I thought that we were going somewhere. So, just to say, this is the party map of Slovakia. And you can see the comings and goings of all of the different political parties. We're quite proud of this map, so we've decided that we're creating some t-shirts. So if you want Party Time Slovakia, then you can buy this it's apparently going to be available on Etsy very soon. I trust Kevin to get that up very soon. But this is the party system that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the Slovak party system here, what we can see is a few parties that have survived for a long period of time, but crucially, we see a lot of new parties kind of emerging. So if we look at the existing lot of new parties or parties in parliament, we can see what Kevin was talking about before, that they're all either very new or relatively new. If we go back an election from that, we can see another set of new parties kind of breaking through. So there's the party Siet. If we go back previous elections, we can see Most Hid being created back in 2010. Saska being created back just before the 2010 elections. Going back even further, the party of Pavel Rusko, ANO, not the Czech ANO, but the Slovak ANO, created back at the beginning of the 21st century. Even further back than that, the party of Civic Understanding, Sopka, back in time for the 98 elections. And the creation of SDK, the Slovak Democratic and Christian Union. So this story of new parties emerging all the time goes back. And in fact, we can even go back to the early 1990s and we can see the party Hnutie za demokratické Slovensko, the movement for democratic Slovakia, Mečiar's party is a kind of new party created as Slovakia was emerging from communism. So this is the kind of story, this tradition of newness in Slovakia is a story that's continued for a long period of time. I've written elsewhere about talking about it being a kind of stable in its instability, really. And in fact, that is a story that we can see played out in political science kind of terminology. So I know there is a couple of political scientists on this call, a few others who aren't, but this is a way of measuring change, which is called volatility. So looking at the movement of votes from parties to other parties at election time. And we can see here that in almost all elections in Slovakia going back to the 1990s, so over 3 decades, a significant amount of churn and change. And it's not just if we look at volatility, another way that we can look at it, and we do this in the book, is to look at the age of the party system, so how old the parties are within the party system. Now, if a party ages, all parties in the system age alongside each other, then you would see that kind of 45-degree line. But what we can see in the Slovak case is this is a party system which isn't getting that much older because of the dying off of a number of older parties and the birth of many new parties. We therefore see this kind of the thick red line showing the kind of newness of the party system. So it's not getting any older. unlike me and Kevin, we're getting older, but the Slovak party system is not getting older. And what's also extremely interesting in this system is to actually look at the voters. So not just looking at the parties, but looking at the voters. And one of the things that we found extremely interesting is that many of the voters who voted for new parties in one wave, in one election, a lot of them were then enticed to vote for an even newer party at the next election. Kevin, you're...
Hold on, sorry.
That's okay. So what we can see is this movement of voters going from new to newer to even newer parties at... Okay,
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just trying to check the chat to see because I saw some questions popping up, but I shouldn't have done that while you were presenting. So hold on. Sorry about that. There we go.
Okay. Yeah. No worries. No worries. No worries. So we can see this kind of pump effect in Slovakia, that voters are enticed by newness, and newness is really important. We actually did a poll for the 2020 elections, and we have some data on that, which shows that newness was an important factor in voting for new parties. But the crucial message that we'd emphasize here is that Slovakia really isn't unusual. So this pump action that we see in Slovakia is also in operation. It's discernible in other countries across the region. So, for example, well, I'm going to show you those in a minute. And so now it is about 7:30 in Slovakia. It's time for pohádky. It's always good in a Zoom call to have a break and some different kind of activities. So I'm going to read for you something from the beginning of the book. We actually start the book with a fairy story. So as I said, it is time for pohádky. So time for Slovak kids to listen to a nice story. Hopefully I won't send you all to sleep. Now, the story that we have in the book is done slightly differently, so you'll have to forgive me that it doesn't quite work as beautifully as I think it does in the book. But anyway, so once upon a time, there was a fresh-faced politician from an established party who did not get a position he thought he deserved. He created a new party, promised to clean up the country's politics, and won a large number of votes. But when he did not get to be prime minister, he reorganized his party, built a strong organization, and promised to help those who were struggling economically. The next time, he got more votes than anyone else and became prime minister. And his party remained strong and powerful for a long, long time, until voters started to notice how corrupt it had become and started to look around for a different, fresh-faced politician who would clean up the country's politics. In another country, there was a king who created a new political party, which he named after himself. He promised to clean up the country's politics, won more votes than anyone else, and became prime minister. But politics did not get much cleaner, and he did not win as many votes the next time. Almost no one lived happily ever after, except for his bodyguard, who created his own new party, promised to clean up the country's politics, won a lot of votes, and became prime minister. In a nearby country, there was a game show host who created a new political party. He dressed in funny outfits in campaign advertisements as a convict, a madman, a vampire, and a courtesan, in which he promised to clean up the country's politics. He won a large number of votes and became Speaker of Parliament. But politics did not get much cleaner, and his party fell apart when he was photographed drinking happily with a local organized crime family. In a third country, not far away, there was a supermarket chain manager who became a big city mayor and created a new political party named after himself. He promised to clean up the country's politics and got more votes than anyone else. But politics did not get much cleaner, and his party fell apart when he was accused of corruption, and he did not win many votes the next time. One person who did was a prominent yet apolitical magistrate who formed a new political party named after himself, promised to clean up the country's politics, won more votes than anyone else, and became prime minister. But that apolitical magistrate saw his popularity fall, and at the next election, a comedian turned mayor who formed a new party named after himself, promised to clean up the country's politics, and became prime minister. So that's the end of the Pohádky time. Hopefully I didn't send you to sleep. But what we wanted to try to emphasize in this story is that Slovakia is not unusual in the sense of this churn of parties. So I was giving you a story there of Bulgaria, of Lithuania, and of Slovenia. So this kind of trend, these kind of patterns of party politics that we see here in this party tree, we can see in those countries. So for example, as I say, this is the Slovak one. If we move on to, and just to emphasize that, it isn't becoming unusual. It's becoming quite widespread. So, okay, in my homeland here in the United Kingdom, we don't quite see this. This is the British party system, which is pretty stable. If you want an even more stable party system, well, where most of you are sitting at the moment, this is the US case. So you can see the difference between the US and countries like Slovakia and the UK. But if we look in many countries across the globe, we see similarities. So this is the Bulgarian party map, even more complicated story with even more new parties being created, other parties dying off with fusions and fissions of parties. So this is Bulgaria, or another country that some of you know quite well is, we've got the Czech Republic next, Kevin. Yeah, sorry, that's Poland. So here's the Polish case, and then on to the Czech case. So all these three cases, but we see this, a similar kind of pattern in virtually all of the 11 states in Central and Eastern Europe that we look at. So it's a pattern that's becoming widespread. So importantly, what we're seeing here is that the Slovak story is similar, certainly to the region, but also, as Kevin will talk about later, even further across the globe as well. And one of the things that's worth kind of emphasizing here is, if we look here at the kind of age story, we can see that the story of Slovakia is similar in all of these other 10 countries across Central and Eastern Europe. Almost every country is basically at the kind of Slovakia's level when it comes to volatility, for example. And indeed, if we look at the case of age, similar kinds of stories, although there are some important variations, and perhaps we can come back in Q&A to talk about variations, for example, between the Czech Republic, for example, and Slovakia and Bulgaria. So it isn't an unusual story. And this is actually the movement of voters in the Czech Republic. Again, you can see a very similar kinds of process, going from new to even newer parties in the second wave and the third wave. This is the case of Slovenia. Again, an even more striking movement of voting for new and then newer and then even newer in the series of elections. And this led us to actually do some theorizing. I recognize that a number of people in this audience will not be quite as excited by political science theory as Kevin and me, but just to say, one of the things that we tried to do here is to talk about this idea of a subsystem of new parties creating even newer parties and voters moving from new to newer. And this actually led us to develop this idea of a party subsystem, and it feeds into one of the arguments that Kevin made before, which is really important to us, that we see our region of the globe not just as one to apply the theories from the United States or Western Europe, but actually it's a region that we think can actually generate theories that and explanations that can travel further than the borders of Slovakia or of the region. And I am now going to pass back over to Kevin, who will do the last 5 minutes or so of the presentation. So thank you, Kevin.
Absolutely. And thank you. And I want to apologize to Tim. Tim has gotten used to my last minute changes of late. And I had some really good ideas, or at least what I thought were good ideas for the presentation just a couple hours before we decided to present. And poor Tim has to deal not only with my delinquent hitting the arrow key to move forward, but then with my sudden changes. So he's got to adapt to constantly dynamic circumstances. I guess we've practiced enough dealing with dynamic circumstances by looking at the Slovak political party system, but he's demonstrated his ability to dance on the wires that I am uncourteous enough to put up for him. So sorry about that, Tim, and thanks for flexing. Yeah, as Tim discussed, this is not something that is unique to Slovakia, but it's also not even something that's unique to Central and Eastern Europe. And what we've noticed over time is, as we study this region, and neither Tim nor I, frankly, ever expected ourselves to become scholars of regions other than the one that Slovakia sits in. But the more we looked at this, the more we saw this stuff isn't just in Eastern Europe. This isn't just a post-communist phenomena. This kind of stuff is actually all over the place. And one of the things that was most surprising and in a weird way most delightful for me was to find that the same phenomenon existed in places even wealthy social democracies like Iceland after the 2009 financial crash, which was particularly acute in Iceland. We found this sudden fragmentation of Iceland's political party system. And since then, they've really never been able to put sort of Humpty Dumpty back together again, that the system has fragmented and remained fragmented. And we get to see this in that same kind of flow diagram that we saw in Central and Eastern Europe as well, with people constantly moving toward newer and newer political parties. And this is particularly nice, actually, because one of the places that you can stop at on the way to Slovakia, if you're traveling from North America, is Iceland. And so I've been really fortunate to develop some relationships with some Icelandic political parties and Icelandic political scientists, where we see these phenomena in place. And so I'm thankful for them for their insights into that. But it's not even just a Western European thing, because what we actually see is that places around the world see this phenomena. Tim and I just presented our book to an audience at Waseda University in Tokyo and had some really good discussions about the way that they see these same phenomena, slightly different, but some similarities in Korea, in Thailand as well. The Japanese scholar suggested that we take a closer look at Thailand and at Indonesia. There are some examples from Africa, in Benin, and to a certain extent in Mozambique, and a few other in the region. Quite a few examples in Latin America. Peru is the one that we see most prominently, but Brazil and Uruguay and a variety of other countries as well, including, especially in Central America, countries like Guatemala and Honduras, and even in a very strange way, the United States. And here I will say, we just showed you a graph that showed that there hasn't been any change in the United States in its two political parties since the 1860s. But some of the same phenomena that we're seeing in Central and Eastern Europe, I would argue, are happening in the United States, not between the two parties. We're not seeing the emergence of new political parties, although who knows, that's a possibility. People have been talking about it. But we're seeing the exact same kind of phenomena within political parties. Those stories that Tim read about the entrepreneur who emerges, says he's going to clean up politics, comes in, doesn't actually make politics any cleaner, is replaced by someone else saying they're going to do the same thing. Those kinds of things, or the politician who comes in with a strong agenda for a kind of radical change in redistribution policy. Those kinds of things I think we see within American parties. If you think of America not as a two-party system, but as two-party systems, because the Republican and the Democratic parties are themselves sort of big, complicated, messy realms of political debate, a lot of the same phenomena appear to be true in the United States, even as we continue with the two existing parties. So I think a lot of the stuff that we're studying really became relevant for the United States as well. And I have increasingly been asked by people who work on American politics to talk about the phenomena that they're seeing in the US and asking whether there's any relevance from Central and Eastern Europe. And it's never a good sign when people say, hey, you studied Eastern Europe. How does that similar to where we are right now? But that is the case at the moment, at least. So we've talked about this big stir, and Tim and I never just like to do stuff that's purely academic and say we've noticed this pattern. We like to actually think about, what does this mean for us, and what should we, if anything, do about it? And so, it's not purely a good thing or a bad thing, but it's something to be worth thinking about. One of our favorite political scientists is a scholar named Peter Mayer, who died really untimely a couple of years ago. And Peter Mayer was really instrumental in devising ways of thinking about political parties. And one of the things that he says that political parties wrestle with the dilemma between sometimes being responsive, between doing what the people want and being responsible, in other words, doing things that have to be done. And quite often in democracy, those two things go together. But when they don't, political parties need to make choices. And there is a way in which these new parties actually, can affect both of those two particular goals. It's often claimed for new political parties, particularly by the leaders of those parties themselves, that the new parties are more responsive, that they do what the people want. They get rid of corrupt leaders, that they get citizens engaged again, they give them something to be excited about, and they even sort of re-energize the existing parties to sort of come out swinging again and to clean themselves up. And so in theory, if new parties are done right, they can achieve those goals. And we've seen some of that in Slovakia. I think, to be fair, we have seen that the government led by ordinary people has been pretty resolute in fighting corruption, in putting people on trial for past abuses. Whether that coalition has engaged in its own abuses or made its own mistakes, I think, is another question. But they certainly have seemed likely to do that. In a lot of other countries, the new parties and the new governments have not been nearly so fortunate, have not been nearly so proactive. And what we often actually seen is that those new parties they become the corrupt. And they simply disillusion the citizens who look and say, oh, well, they aren't any better than the previous ones. I guess I'll have to vote for someone newer the next time. And they don't necessarily re-energize the establishment parties. They force them out of business to be replaced by this series of ongoing new political parties. There is not one political party in Slovakia's parliament right now that was there in the decade after the fall of communism. Despite some strong, well-built political parties, all of them have been displaced by these newer parties, and the newer parties have much shorter lifespans. Even the long-lived ones like Smer tend to have a shelf life of about a generation, and many of the smaller ones have a shelf life of about one election. And so a lot of the claims for being responsive don't seem to really apply all that well. And there, we think, is a real question about whether these new parties can actually serve that goal of responsibility. When we've looked at the region, we see that these parties actually do tend to sort of undermine the long-term relationships that can stabilize political life. Parties build sort of informal relationships with other political parties. That allows a certain kind of predictability in government formation and in who will do what when. But if the players in the game are constantly to build up those long-term stable relationships. And there is a huge problem, a huge question with time horizons. And this is something that Tim and I are just starting to study. But it's the more we study it, something we really feel concerned about, and we really feel needs a lot more attention, which is the ability, how far into the future can you look? If anything, the problems that we all face are requiring longer and longer time horizons rather than shorter and shorter ones. And yet the political parties in Central and Eastern Europe, the political factions in the United States, which are dealing with those parties, increasingly have shorter and shorter timeframes because they don't necessarily even expect to survive to the next generation. A lot of the parties that are created in Central and Eastern Europe, they know that they are not in it for the long run, they're in it for the short run. And sometimes those short run goals are good, but they don't expect that they will found the next 100-year party They won't be founding the next Christian Democratic Party in Germany or the next Socialist Party in Spain. They will be founding a party that will exist for a few years, and then something will happen to it. Kind of like internet startups, get founded in the hope that they're going to be bought out by Google or Microsoft or other things. If you have short-term time horizons like that, it's hard to plan for long-term policy. There just aren't those kinds of incentives. Is there any hope for this? Well, when we did our study, what we found is that there actually is a significant difference between parties that were created early in post-communism, which tended to have fairly strong organization and represented really kind of durable, sustainable issues, and were able to replace their political leaders when they got compromised, and parties that were created later in the cycle. The parties, the newer the party, the more likely it is to have a really weak organization, usually based around the internet. The more likely it is to focus on corruption, which is an issue that's very hard to sustain over the long run. And the more likely they were to be led by a single charismatic political leader who was very difficult to displace. That list of political parties that I showed you in Slovakia's parliament right now, of the 6 political parties that are represented in Slovakia's parliament, only one has ever changed its leadership. So every one of those, almost all of the major parties in Slovakia have had the same leader for their entire lives. That's not a sustainable situation. And it means that those parties last about as long as their leaders last, or their leaders remain uncorrupted. And when they don't, you get into these cycles of constant regeneration and shorter time horizons. And the one good finding that we've got in this regard is that parties are able to learn. And we're not always big fans of the way that Fico Smer ran Slovakia or how they did it. But the interesting thing about the party is that it was the same as all of those other new startup parties at the very beginning. Same kinds of issues, same kinds of emphasis, same focus on corruption. But the party learned. When it didn't immediately get the prize of the premiership, Fico stood back. He redesigned his party. He reorganized it around a durable issue, social justice, socioeconomic redistribution. He built a strong organization. So parties can learn how to do this if we give them the incentive as voters to do it. The one thing that these new parties don't seem to have learned, whether in Slovakia or anywhere else, is how to replace their leader. We see very few of these new parties that are built in such a way that when the leader creates problems or gets indicted or brought up on corruption charges, that they can get rid of those leaders. And so that seems to be the kind of one barrier that keeps parties from actually learning enough to build a sustainable new generation of long-lasting political parties. We don't know if that can happen. We haven't seen it yet. There are some new political parties like the Czech Pirate Party and a couple of others that seem a little less leader focused. So maybe some of the hope lies there. But this does seem to be the kind of Rubicon that parties have not yet been able to cross, and the one thing that keeps us from developing sort of stable new parties to replace the old ones rather than that constant churn. And I think this is a big issue for all of us. And I want to just sort of end on this note that there's a lot of focus on studies of Central and Eastern Europe about the challenges to democracy in those countries. And a lot of times that focuses on leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Kaczynski in Poland. It focuses on the radical right or the radical left. But what we would argue is that there is another challenge to democracy that is posed by these new political party leaders who are in this game of constant change and constant churn. It may not lead to an immediate demise of democracy, but it lowers the time horizons that allows democracy to deal with the problems that it has to deal with if we're going to survive, either as democracies or frankly as a civilized species. So those are the big questions. And of course, the big answer is nicely summarized by the Slovak political cartoonist Shuti. And actually, you can see right over Tim's shoulder this exact same cartoon that democracy in the end, and this is a lesson whether it's Slovaks or Americans or people in any of the other countries from whom you are out there watching today, that democracy takes work. And so it's on that note that we want to finish. We want to take your questions. Sorry if we've gone a little bit over on time, But we're so appreciative of you giving us your Saturday afternoon, and we would love to talk about this because it's from audiences that we learn what we need to be working on. And for Tim and I both, I think this has become a lifelong project, just like Slovakia has become a lifelong love. So we're going to keep at this, and we'd love to know what you'd love to know more about and answer any questions that we can that you have. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Kevin and Tim. Yeah, so we'll hop right into the chat questions here. We have quite a few in the chat. So I guess the first one comes from Carol Leff. Her question is, what about extra system volatility as a measure for your research?
Do I take that, Kevin?
Or... Yeah, why don't you go for that one?
Yeah, so
and explain it a little bit.
Indeed, I was going to say that for the non-political scientists, basically to try to think about volatility of change, that traditional measures have simply had one score for volatility. And what a couple of groups of scholars sought to do was to say, well, maybe what we need to do is to distinguish between the movement of votes from party A to party B within the system, as opposed to the movement of votes from a party within the system to a new political party. So the extra system idea is this idea of moving from parties in the system to new political parties. Is it a useful measure? Yes, it is. We do find it quite helpful. The one challenge with the measure of volatility, and particularly this distinction, is that what exactly we think of as a new political party and how we deal with that. So then that becomes an issue of whether we think that a splinter of a party should be treated in exactly the same way as a brand new creation. So in the Slovak case, for example, we might think of a party, let's take the party Most Hid, which was formed back in 2009 and run up to 2010 election. That was a breakaway from the ethnic Hungarian SMK. Now, should we treat that or think about that in the same way as the creation of Saska, Freedom and Solidarity, for that same election? And so one of the problems with extra system volatility as a measure is you then have to make, you then have to think about how exactly you're going to define or where you're going to draw the line for newness. Now, without going into boring, nerdy detail, in the book, we do discuss this in a lot of detail, actually. But crucially, what we say is that wherever you broadly draw the line, the story is quite similar. The problem with extra system volatility measure in particular is it's then heavily contingent on how you classify those kinds of parties. So we do use it, but it has its problems.
So instead you use age as an indicator without trying to adjudicate.
Well, we do use volatility, but we don't, because of the problems inherent in operationalizing volatility, you can't rely on it by itself. So we do have in the book, we do use volatility scores, but we think that, like any measure, it measures something, but it doesn't always measure everything that we're trying to do, which is to capture this, the extent of change in the party system.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for that stupidly technical political sciencey question as a starting one.
No,
okay.
Carol, it gives us a chance to show off the fact that we really do technical and nerdy stuff, but we just won't bore everybody with it.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks, Carol. We'll move on to the next question here. Next question comes from Michael Kopanich. He's asking, what impact has COVID-19 played in the churning of parties and the emergence of new ones, both in Slovakia and elsewhere?
That's a great question, Michael. We haven't done any there hasn't been any good systematic work on it yet. But so anecdotally, we can talk about this. There is a certain way in which at the depths of its, at the depths of COVID, I think the pandemic is actually sort of mitigated against the creation of new political parties. There's one particular example in the Czech Republic. You saw actually the proto-emergence of a kind of Million Moments party based on the protests of last year. But with everybody in lockdown, the party wasn't able to sort of get itself started in the way that it wanted. So it may have actually delayed the creation of some parties, at least the kinds of work that required that those parties needed to do that involved in-person contact. But in some other countries where the parties got started just before the pandemic hit, we've actually seen that the chaos around COVID policy has created some openings for those new political parties. So if you look at the country of Bulgaria, for example, we didn't really talk about Bulgaria, but fascinating example for any of you who want to look at it. The Bulgarian elections, a situation where you had one fairly significant political party, a lot like Fico Smer in Slovakia, although maybe slightly more to the right economically. You saw that party, GERB, run by Boyko Borisov, have a serious challenger from a pop star, a singer named Slavi Trifonov, who created a party called There Is Such a People, and really ran his entire campaign by running a bunch of online concerts. Exactly the kind of figure that we predict in the book. We're kind of sad that the book actually was so accurate in its predictions. But so we do see, on the one hand, I think there have been some difficulties created by the pandemic in helping these parties get formed. But on the other hand, I think the dealing with the pandemic has created a variety of opportunities for new parties to harvest if they were able to get organized before that period. So Trifonov's party was one of those. In general, we've been looking to see, has there been any kind of increase or decrease in new party formation over the last 2 years since we finished a data collection for the book? And if anything, the numbers are running slightly higher in the last 2 years than they were in the previous decade.
And maybe if I can just add, thanks, Kevin, for a great answer. Just a couple of, bringing it back to the Slovak case. I mean, what's really striking, of course, Hlas was created after the election. The election took place on the 29th of February, just as the pandemic was beginning to hit. Now, arguably the split may well have been on the cards anyway, but the fact that you still saw that split, the fact that you've seen this reconfiguration of the ethnic Hungarian parties is showing that there really is still a drive for change. And Zaludi, for example, the new party that broke through, is experiencing a lot of churn itself, with a few people having left the party, and real question marks over the new leader of the party at the moment. Perhaps the one big issue is the issue of competence, which is becoming perhaps more important than the issue of corruption during the pandemic.
Yeah, one wonders if there's not going to be a new spurt of parties after this pandemic passes, and it will pass. As we know from things like the Spanish influenza, they do pass, and people react very, very emphatically after a normal society reemerges.
Absolutely. I think that's going to, we're really very curious about that. We're going to follow that really, really closely. I will be very curious to see what role pandemic response effectiveness plays, that question, that competence that Tim raised. To what extent does that become a dynamic? I think during the pandemic, both sides have sort of stayed away from it. But once we have a kind of reckoning of who did better or who did worse, when you can look at a country and say you had much higher death rates than nearby countries, or an American state and say you had much higher death rates than a nearby state, I wonder if you start seeing that playing a role in that political debate. That does provide the ammunition. And once the pandemic's over and those kinds of formation opportunities are more available, you could indeed see that.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. This comes from David Frankel. His question is, Does your research suggest anything that's actionable for politicians to consider as they seek to increase their electoral successes? Are there procedures or substantive positions they should consider to gain success?
Tim?
Well, thank you for the question. So I think this question came in, I think, before Kevin had mentioned a couple of things in the presentation. So forgive me for coming back, but the three elements that we see as very important for endurance. The first is organizational structures. Old-fashioned organization actually really matters. That's not to say that more modern forms of organization are not important, but old-fashioned organizational structures seem quite important. Secondly, it's about the party becoming more than just the leader. So Kevin mentioned about leadership challenges. The problem with parties so heavily dependent on leaders is they are then contingent on that biology. But if a party develops the structures, becomes more than an individual, the party is likely to endure. And then finally, it's often about the kinds of appeals, the kinds of policies that they make. You know, appeals like corruption or anti-corruption or novelty are like kind of fresh fish. They go off pretty quickly, right? What you really want is a long, enduring appeal, something that has a very long shelf life. If you were a British audience, I would point to Marmite, but I think that that cultural reference is probably lost on almost all of you. But I would say that appeals often, you know, ethnically based appeals are often the basis for longevity we see across the region, for example, or very clear kind of deep socio-economic appeals. But a lot of these new parties are being formed with appeals around novelty, around anti-corruption, and around celebrity, and these are not the ingredients for longevity.
I will say Tim and I have talked to enough political party leaders, and especially people from new political parties. And I had an experience a couple of years ago in Finland, you know, meeting the head of a new political party and listening to his plans and thinking, oh, if only I were here to advise you instead of to listen, you know, because the parties seem to make a lot of the same mistakes. And, you know, Tim and I, after looking at this for so long, I mean, that, you know, the ability to organize yourself, the ability to, you know, make sure that there is a leadership alternative. These aren't things that'll get you started quickly. In fact, what we found is that, you know, the stuff that gets you started quickly, the stuff that is most appealing to sort of rocket you to initial success, actually then starts to act as a barrier to the things that'll keep you alive longer. So, you know, there is a certain way in which these parties are born with structures that increase their growth early, but those exact same things tend to make them much more fragile later on. And so, if a party like Fico Smed really had to make a tough choice early on in its existence to stop going for the easy stuff and to actually do some really serious, deep investment in both new issues that were sustainable, like economics, and, you know, an organization. And Fico's party really, you know, sort of built and acquired a really extensive organizational network. But that's probably what accounts for the party's longevity. If Fico could have mastered that third art of getting out of the way once he was blocking his party's success, I don't think we'd be looking at the party Hlas at 24% and Fico's party only at 9%.
Okay. Now the next question we have is from Ken Bombara. His question is, are there differences in the financing of parties in the countries you study? Also, our US political parties have large bureaucracies of think tank people, academics, lawyers that flip back and forth between government and the private sector. Does this characterize Slovak politics?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, would you?
Yeah, I'll start on that. So on the financing issue, so Slovakia, like all of the countries that we look at, the one exception was Latvia for a while. They have state funding of political parties. And that's the primary source for funding for political parties. Now, the point about state funding of parties is that is usually contingent on your performance at the last election and the number of MPs that you have. And this varies across the region, exactly how it's arranged. But what that does mean is if you are a new political party and you want to set up, you usually need money from somewhere else. And this is where what we've often seen is the linkages between successful new parties and with links particularly to kind of business interests, or indeed very, very rich businessmen themselves. And probably the best example in the region is not a Slovak one, but a Czech one. If we look at Andrej Babiš, he, the second richest man in the Czech Republic, he's often described as, and he was able to use the wealth from Agrofert, his company, to basically bankroll the party in those early days. I mean, still important for funding now, but it was important as a kind of startup. So financing does kind of skew the story to some extent. Of course, what we also see sometimes is those parties that are splits or splinters away. Then sometimes, because they have MPs in Parliament, then they can sometimes get some funding, although that varies across the board. On the, I think the second question is probably Kevin may be better placed to answer. I would just say that from my knowledge of US politics, the Brookings Institute is the Democratic Party in exile when there's a Republican president, and then they all move from Brookings to the White House when a Democrat becomes president. There isn't that kind of churn that you see in DC. For at least that's what I would say about Central and Eastern Europe. But Kevin knows more about American politics than me, so may want to say something about that second point.
Well, this is actually something Carol may know better than many of us, because she's been looking at cabinet ministers and where they come from and where they go, and some really incredibly extensive research. So Carol, if you want to weigh in, but that kind of formal network of think tanks and others isn't necessarily as robust. Obviously, it's a much smaller system, but there is some kind of movement back and forth between political parties and kind of nonprofit groups and others, particularly on, I guess, what we would call the civic right. You don't see that nearly as much on the left or in the kind of nationalist or the Hungarian camps. One of the things that does tend to happen is that, to the extent that there is proportional representation, parties don't alternate quite as much, and they don't sort of shift back and forth. And so, there can be a little bit more stability in terms of staff and some other things that have some continuation over time. But Carol, any thoughts on that? Like, do you see that kind of coming and going between Parliament and particular groups? Oh, you're on mute.
Not exactly. I mean, you find people coming from time to time coming out of the NGO sector, right?
Yep.
Yeah. But my sense is across the board, the sort of, one of the things that can happen in a number of these countries is the old, and this is something we do not have in the same way. I mean, we have an Academy of Sciences in the United States, but the academies of sciences, which include history and social sciences across Eastern Europe, and to the extent that I know about them, across some of the West European countries, are really think tanks for a lot of these issues. And they get dragged into all kinds of, whether they choose to be proactive politically or not, all kinds of controversies like, what do we do with historical memory, right? Is that going to be used in politics? But I don't have a generalizable feeling about this. I just know that some of the pollers, some of the in a number of these new countries, some of the institutes that like Slovakia, those people are not only serious pollers, and I'm also thinking of Russia in this regard. They sort of stand against, they want authentic results of public opinion standing against whoever's in power. But the whole think tank idea, of course, had to be built from scratch after 1989. And that's why I'm emphasizing some of the academies.
Yep.
Um,
It is interesting, you know, the German political party law creates the establishment of political think tanks, and those have actually had a broad international reach. Now, those are limited to really the three kind of ideological realms of the three German parties at the time. So there is a kind of social democratic one, there is a conservative one, and there is a European style classical liberal one. So those have played a role. You know, the American
yeah, we have them too.
Yep, the International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute, those have played a small role. And then, of course, the EU has played a significant role. Tim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I just see David Frankel just made a good point about Mr. Desaj and Ineko, think tanks that contributed. Absolutely. I would perhaps say what matters here is the kind of cult sometimes of the odbornik, the cult of the kind of expert, someone who knows how to do something. So we sometimes see those sorts of people are brought in. I just don't think, but again, I'm not an expert on US politics. I don't think it's kind of to the same extent that we see in the United States, but I'm happy to be corrected on that, given my lack of knowledge of the US case.
Yeah, you know, some of the people who deal with elite recruitment in new democracies point out that it's kind of hard, and even for a small party, it's kind of hard to recruit the people you need, not so much to run your campaign, but after you get in, who's going to be the cabinet minister? And those people may not have been politically active to begin with, but they're needed, you know, to fill the, you know, to fill the gaps. And especially these new parties come in with limited political experience, and then they have to bring in people who may not have been associated with the party electorally beforehand.
That's right. You know, you go, Tim. I'm sorry.
Well, I apologize. I was just going to say, just look at the number of non-party ministers in the Czech case at the moment from ANO. That's a good example of where expertise has been brought in. Sorry.
No, I mean, you know, I had the experience, and one of the parties actually that's managed to survive, I think, you know, largely by accident in a couple of different elections, has been the party SAS. Of Richard Sulik, which sort of goes back and forth and has actually, you know, become the second most durable party in the Slovak system. Now, admittedly, that's 11 years. It's not a whole long time. But I remember early on having a conversation with someone who's actually subsequently left SAS and gone to two different parties. But that person saying, as a member of parliament, that, you know, the party development stopped immediately when they got elected and got into government, because they didn't have enough people to fill government positions and run a party. So they dropped the party staff of this party, which had, you know, 11% in the election, dropped to one person staffing the party and one person sort of guarding the door of the party building. And that was the party's entire non-parliamentary, non-governmental staff. And so you do tend to see this. I think it's also one of the reasons why you get a lot of these, you know, corruption scandals, because people without a lot of vetting are brought onto party lists, because there's not a lot of, you know, people's personal networks only go so far, and there's only a certain amount of time available for vetting those lists. And even when you get into government, you know, you're bringing in sometimes people who are willing to follow the line of the political party, but they may not be that connected with the party. I think, Tim, you had an experience with the Slovenian parties, with Viron's list, didn't you, in those terms, about the difficulty of actually recruiting and getting people involved?
Yes, no, absolutely. So, you know, they were kind of having to, they were calling up people that they knew with expertise, and then enticing them to join in because they needed people to fill official positions. I mean, there is a kind of size issue that matters here. In a relatively small state, you don't have that many people with expertise. So you kind of sometimes have to really scrape the bottom of the barrel to find anything.
Right. People calling up say, hey, would you like to be Minister of the Environment? We need somebody. And that's not as far from the truth. And it is interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember this is now 15 years ago, but Macedonia, which is a fairly small country with a small elite, this guy was called home to be Minister of Economics or Finance. He was still in grad school in England.
Okay, so the next question I have, it's from Helen Fedor. She asks, in Slovakia, are the new parties mainly splinters of old parties, or are they formed by or coalesce around new actors?
Ooh, I can answer this one. I don't know, those of you with kids, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I have this amazing experience, like when my kids finally ask me a question that I can actually answer without having to pretend or lie or fake it. So Helen, in Slovakia, actually the answer is just roughly split down the middle. We've actually coded all of the political parties in Slovakia, and there's some that are kind of, it's not quite clear, because if somebody leaves the party but then 4 years later founds his own party, does that count as a splinter or not? We actually deal with that quite a bit in the book. Slovakia has moved from a system in which most of the new parties were splinters to a system in which they're about roughly evenly distributed. There are some countries where most of the new parties tend to be just really completely out of the blue new parties. We have a colleague named Alan Sik who talks about genuinely new parties. In some of the Baltic countries and in Slovenia, we tend to see that. There are a variety of other countries where almost all of the new parties come as splinters. And I think there is a genuine academic question about whether we should even be considering both of these new parties, both of these new kinds of parties, as the same thing. In our estimates, we tend to deal with them the same way. And in some ways, they're really not. A party that is a splinter or a split, we say fission in our book from previous parties. It can be a little bit different because the people will have been politically known, it will have had a trail of voters. But at the same time, we argue when we're doing our standards that every split and splinter actually has to deal with the same challenges as a new political party. They may be a little bit more known, but they still have to deal with kind of how to create a platform, how to build an organization, usually from scratch, and so on. And so, it does make, I think there are some commonalities. There are also certainly some differences. I mean, the really big difference, I think, in some ways is, does the celebrity on which the new party is based, does that celebrity come from within politics, or does the celebrityness come from outside of politics? And I think, one of the things we haven't really talked about is the degree to which the people we're seeing in these new political parties are coming from, many of them coming from way outside the political realm. And so, these days, the best pathway to political success as a newcomer, is things like a television journalist, sometimes television psychiatrist, like a Dr. Oz or someone like that. Sometimes it's as a rock star. There are quite a few musicians, both in Bulgaria and in Croatia. In the last year, a kind of pop folk rock musician has gotten 15% of the vote. Poland, we've seen that happen as well. We see a variety of sort of reality TV stars. That may sound familiar to some of you in the audience, but people from the equivalent of the Shark Tank or from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And we see a variety of people who've not only made money, but made themselves famous in the business realm as entrepreneurs. So, those are places where a lot of the newness comes from. Those parties do seem to operate slightly differently, and I would argue usually less durably than ones that are where the celebrity comes from someone who achieved prominence in another party and has gone on to found her own or his own.
All right, we have one more question from the chat. This comes from Richard Morris, and his question is about the current snap election referendum. His questions are: has there ever been an early election before? Why is there so much interest? And if the referendum succeeds, is a new election mandatory? So can you give some background on that?
Yeah. So let me take these working backwards, actually. So the legal position is that referendum is advisory rather than legally required to follow it. However, politics, I mean, you know, I'm zooming in from the UK. Our referendum on Brexit was formally advisory, but there was no way that politicians were going to ignore that. I mean, given the way, the process that happened, so a huge number of signatures have been acquired. They've been given to submitted to the president. They've been verified. Certainly, the number of verified signatures is greater than the requirement. The president, she has decided to refer this to the Constitutional Court. If the Constitutional Court says that a referendum should go ahead, the idea that politically you could then have a referendum and ignore the result of it, I think is impossible. I mean, it just wouldn't happen. So if there's going to be a referendum, it's like, you know, it will, and that calls for early elections, then early elections would happen. Why has there been so much interest? Well, although Robert Fico and Peter Pellegrini are very keen to emphasize that this is not their petition, it's clear that that Hlas and Smer have been very important in mobilizing a significant number of voters to sign up for this. So why so much interest? It's linked in really to complaints or criticisms of the current functioning of the government, criticisms of Matovic, who he was rather erratic as prime minister. He's now rather erratic as finance minister. The new prime minister is a lot more kind of stable kind of figure. And of course, a lot of the people who are asking for early elections through the referendum are those who were not supporters of those parties that form the government. So it's really coming from the kind of opposition. In terms of referendum on early elections before, I'm just trying to double check, thinking through all of the other referendums that have been held. I don't think there is one. Kevin, just correct me.
Yeah, I think actually only one or two referendums have ever gotten above the turnout threshold.
Yeah. I mean I think that's a slightly different question to what he was asking, whether there's ever been an early election. Is the question an early election or an early election dependent on a referendum? If there's a question, has there ever been an early election before? Absolutely. And we can point to 2012 as a good example of that. That also was a time where you had a four-party coalition, a non-Smer coalition that had been formed. And one of the reasons why the coalition survived the recent coalition crisis is because, and the changing of the guard in terms of the prime minister, is because those parties do not want an early election, which is likely to be bad news for all of those, or almost all of those parties, to be sure. There are early elections tomorrow. Hlas of Pellegrini's Hlas would be the largest party by a significant margin. Sorry.
Yeah, so there were unexpected. There have been there was a 1990 to 1992 was deliberately a 2-year period, but then there were early elections in 94. Again, early elections in 2012, and then we'll see what happens now.
Okay, there's another question came up in the chat. This is from David Frankel again. His question is, if members of national legislatures represent specific geographic districts rather than their political parties generally, could this have a positive effect on extending the longevity of political parties?
So maybe one of the things that would be worth emphasizing to this audience is that the electoral system in Slovakia operates a single national list. So there's no geographical representation whatsoever in the Slovak case. There's a criticism sometimes that it's too kind of Bratislava centric, but that's for another time. Would this kind of make a difference? Well, as comparative political scientists, we would look at other kind of cases. And actually what's kind of interesting is one of the other countries that we've looked at is Lithuania. And Lithuania operates a mixed electoral system whereby half of the MPs are elected in districts representing geographical regions and the other half by national lists. And in Lithuania, we don't see that having much of an impact. We see the emergence of quite a few new parties in Lithuania, so it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. Of course, what it would do is it would change the calculus to some extent, because those politicians may feel that they have a mandate from the people that they're representing rather than representing the party interests. So could it make a positive effect? Possibly, but it could actually at the same time actually create more incentives for people to kind of break away and form little parties representing their own regions. So sorry, Davidko, to give you an answer that would say it could go both ways.
If I could just add to that, I think there are two separate questions that are going on. One is the question about regional representation. That's something Slovakia had in its parliament up until 1998. Yeah. And so, you know, what should you have regions represented? Some of the countries we've looked at have, you know, sort of regions that are represented. Others use single nationwide lists. So the Czechs, for example, have regions that are formally represented. Poles do as well. We're not seeing a lot of difference in those countries between those countries and Slovakia in terms of the overall churn, at least in the last 10 years of new and old. The other question is whether you go so small with your representation that you have the American style, what we say first past the post or winner take all single member districts. That's what Tim was talking about with Lithuania, at least for part of its electoral system. But when you get into that kind of change, then the regionalization also changes the calculus of elections completely, because you have to win 50% of the vote, or at least win more than anybody else, in order to actually win a seat. So, you know, a second question that you could ask is, could, you know, that first past the post electoral system produce stability? It certainly acts as a disincentive to smaller parties. Now, that can increase stability, but it can also reduce the ability of those smaller parties to get voice. And, you know, there's some really strong debate between people about whether it's better to have, you know, more parties representing more interests or fewer parties representing, you know, fewer interests or an aggregate of interest. One of the downsides of those kinds of election systems we actually see in Hungary. So Hungary elects more than half of its voters with American style, Canadian style, British style, winner take all single member districts. What happened there was that one party, which had a slight lead over a bunch of other parties, actually managed to win almost all of those seats. And so in the single member district seats of the Hungarian parliament, the Fidesz party, even with only about 40% of the vote, managed to win over 90% of the seats. That actually stops the creation of new parties, but it only stops the creation of new parties by shutting down democracy entirely, almost. And so, you know, Tim and I have dealt with this in the book, but really, you know, there is a cure to the emergence of new parties, but it involves poisoning democracy. And so, you know, maybe the cure isn't worth you know, the cure is worse than the disease.
All right, so so we have, I guess we've gone through all the chat questions here. I'd like to give anyone else an opportunity if they want to ask a question to our two presenters today. We'll take one or two questions and then we'll conclude for the day. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please unmute yourself.
I wanted to ask something that I asked him privately, but almost by accident because it's a general question. One of the things I noticed in the last few years, which from my perspective was hopeful, and it reminded me of earlier periods in Slovak post-communist history, was when there's a threat to democracy, or when people perceive one, what you get in the European Parliament's last elections and in Slovakia and in this country is turnout goes way up because people are mobilizing actually probably on both sides of the issue. My question to the two of you, I mean, I'm not asking you to adjudicate my facts because I think they're correct. Do you think that this really is a kind of response? I mean, do you think that in linking those three things, the EU Parliament elections and the United States and Slovakia and the rise in turnout really reflects that kind of populist mobilization, or is there really a difference between the story you would tell about what happened in Slovakia and what happened, for example, in our election, where the presidential turnout was suddenly higher than it had been for a while, for 100 years, I think?
So I would say one crucial thing is that when voters perceive that an election is really important and is an important choice in front of them, and there is a chance to make a choice one way or another, that you can mobilize voters to turn out. I mean, I'm unlike almost everyone on this call, I'm not American, so I should be very careful about talking American politics to you guys. But from my perspective, that seems to explain to a significant degree both the mobilization for Biden, but also the counter mobilization on the Trump side. In the Slovak case, you know, when was the biggest turnout? It was 1998. The 1998 election in Slovakia was a big choice. Was Slovakia going to continue down the path of Mečiar and illiberalism, or was it going to take a different direction? And that was crucial in mobilizing voters to turn out. You know, I turnout can be about more things than that. There's plenty of scholarship that suggests there are many more things than that. But I think, does it matter? Is the choice really significant? And does it look as if your vote is going to make a difference? Is often at the heart of explaining turnout.
Okay. All right. So, okay. We'll take one last question from Helen Fedor.
Okay.
Helen?
Tim and Kevin, what happens when the turnout doesn't meet the legal requirement, I think it's whatever the percentage of registered voters, say you get, I don't know, you miss it by say 5 percentage points. What happens with that result then? Is it just totally then disregarded because you didn't have enough voters turning out, or what happens with it?
Are you saying this in terms of referendums, right?
Right.
Yeah. So in terms of referendums, a referendum will not be valid unless the correct number of voters, the threshold for the number of voters to vote is met. And we saw that the EU accession referendum back in 2003 was actually quite close to not crossing the required threshold. And if that hadn't have crossed the threshold, then the referendum would have failed.
That's right. And actually, I just was able to pull up the numbers on this. That's the only referendum in Slovakia ever to pass the threshold. So there was a referendum on privatization in 1994 that got 20%. There was an early elections referendum in 2001 that got 20%. Another early elections referendum in 2004 that got 35%. And then there were some other reforms and a gay marriage referendum, both which averaged around 22, 23%. So really, you know, the only times you've ever gotten anything close to that was the European Union referendum, and then another one that was held at the same time as parliamentary elections. But what's really interesting is that you end up, that the turnout requirement is another decision point. So you get into different kinds of strategy. You know, instead of political parties or political leaders telling voters to vote no, they tell them to stay home. But you've got to hope that enough people stay home to keep you from passing the threshold. You don't want to tell them to go vote no, because your best chance of getting rid of it is just to fall below the threshold. But, you know, I guess you have to tell them vote no, but if you don't want to, don't vote at all, or don't vote, but if you must vote, vote no. But there is a kind of weird calculus that starts to happen. It's so easy to get people not to do things that you know, that tends to be the modal kind of operation in Slovakia's referendums so far.
All right, thank you. So that was our last question for today. So I would like to thank Kevin and Tim for a great presentation today, and also our audience for all your great questions and a great discussion. So a few of you in the chat asked about the book, and so after the event today, we'll be sending out a link for where folks can purchase the book, and also a discount code. So we'll be getting to that to you shortly, and hopefully a recording of this presentation we'll try and get this recording up on our YouTube channel very soon too, and we'll also notify you of that when it's available. So, and I guess before we go, I do want to say I'm definitely interested in the shirt. So if your Etsy shop is for real,
it will be. My goal was to have it up by the time of this presentation, but I ended up spending time on the presentation. So I hope that wasn't a bad choice. But I promise you that I will create it. And then for your friends in neighboring countries, we actually hope to have them up for all 11. And I am currently working on the spaghetti mess that is Italy, which is the world's largest East European party system. Yeah, though we hope to make a minor businesses. And just if anyone's wondering, all proceeds will go to the Roma Education Fund. So it's not something we want to make money off of. And in fact, to the contrary, we'd like to see that go to people who need the help.
All right. Okay, that's great. It's great to hear that. So yeah, and obviously when it's ready, we'll pass that link along to everyone too. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to putting on my shirt. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I would wish everyone to have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see you back here soon. So take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Ďakujeme.